thank you very much for coming the second to last session to hear Josipa and me present this latest research. You know, a few things have changed in the 3 years since the first book was published. For one thing, we have these handouts now about students' accounts, and partly that's due to I need reading glasses now. You know, through just 3 years, but apparently right in the life stage where, and so this will help. That aid hopefully will help us get through sharing the narrative, the vignette, narrative vignette with you. Also, a little bit shifts in the, in the newspapers. We came here 3 years ago, and we were all lamenting how these newspaper accounts of colleges and universities spending money on climbing walls. And, now 3 years later, we're lamenting them spending money on lazy rivers. So there things have shifted in the landscape. We're going to start by giving a quick Cliff Notes version of Academically Adrift, just one slide, which summarizes some of the main findings from that first book. And I think you can think of the findings in the first book as being in three big buckets. The first is the set of findings on limited academic rigor in higher education. And we relied in the research on student survey responses, where students were surveyed at the second semester of their sophomore year, and they were asked to think about the semester that came before, which turns out to be a fairly representative semester in terms of academic experiences. And 45% of the students said they did not have a single class with 20 pages of reading. 20 pages of writing over the course of the semester. So let me say that again. 45%, almost half, said they didn't have even a single class with 20 pages of writing. 32% didn't have a single class with more than 40 pages of reading per week. And 36% of the students said they studied alone 5 or fewer hours per week. So very limited academic engagement, academic commitment, academic rigor. And the second set of findings was that, given this very weak educational treatment, there was limited learning demonstrated on these generic assessments. The generic assessments we used was the CLA, the Collegiate Learning Assessment, which gives people a set of documents, asks them to think critically about the documents, synthesize information across documents, and then write a response based on that. And when you measured these documents at 2 points in time, the beginning of college and 2 years later, there was very modest growth. And again, you would expect that if you surveyed the students and asked them about their academic engagement in the courses they're taking. We had 0.18 standard deviation growth over that time period. And another way to think about it is if the CLA was scored 0 to 100, 45% of students would not have moved even 1 point on the exam over that time period. And then finally, and this was a real important part of the book, but often got lost in the media accounts of it, there was significant variation in student experiences in terms of academic rigor and student growth. So it was a story, Josipa's eye as social scientists, it's a story about variation. And first of all, we found greater variation within colleges than across colleges and universities, very similar to K-12 education. So it mattered very much what you did within the institution you went to. And so that led us to argue for the importance of focusing on building cultures of assessment and teaching and learning within the institutions, not relying on an accountability system that measures school performance in the aggregate to improve performance. We also demonstrated that academic rigor was associated with improved learning outcomes, and the CLA, like all assessment indicators, has its limitations. It's imperfect. It's flawed, like every other indicator. But we showed in the book that it was sensitive to instruction, and that if students had courses with more reading and writing and studied longer hours, their CLA growth was higher. And last kind of key point, we found that in the core, the arts and science core of the colleges and universities, you had slightly larger gains, and those gains were also associated with greater academic rigor in the courses, slightly more reading, writing, and students spending more time studying. So that's basically the quick version of Academically Adrift, and so it's nice to now have the one-page Cliff Notes version because, of course, one of the findings is college students don't often have courses with more than 40 pages of reading. So it would take them a whole month, 4 weeks, to get through the book, a 150-page book. So now we've got the Cliff Notes version. It'll be up on the internet after. You know, this is a real public service, we think, putting it all in one page like this. Pivot now to 3 years later and our current study. And what I'd like to do now is quickly present what we hope to cover in describing this research. First, how do students experience college in terms of their academic and social orientations? So in the first book, we just kind of assumed that students were in college and university primarily to learn and primarily to focus on academic activities. And this, in the second book, given the findings in the first, we don't start with that presumption. And so we ask students what they're doing and how they're thinking about academic and social orientations in college. Second, we follow them 2 years after graduation, and we seek to identify how they are doing in making those transitions during a very difficult economic period in U.S. history. And then also, again, because we're able to interview them, we asked how they understand these trajectories. What are they thinking about the difficulties and successes that they're facing? Third, we have this, our study is unique in having this measure of generic skills and performance at the end of college. To what extent is it associated with postgraduate outcomes? And so we'll focus on documenting and demonstrating that here. And then finally, we'll shift to what higher education can do to more effectively prepare students for successful transitions. And part of that might depend on the question right before. If these generic competencies matter, that might be one thing colleges and universities could do, but it's probably not the only one. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Our data set that we rely on for the study is the following. It's the Determinants of College Learning data set. We joined an existing project that the Council for Aid to Education had started in 2005, where they gave students an assessment of their general abilities, the CLA, when they entered college, fall 2005. They take the assessment again, we collected transcripts and surveyed them in 2007. That's the first book. We follow them up again spring 2009, which, if they're on time, they're set to graduate then. Again, they're assessed, and then we give them surveys. And then we do two post-college surveys 210 and 211, which would be 1 and 2 years out if they're, again, on time and on track. It's a large-scale project, but it is not a national probability study. There is some significant attrition in the study, where in particularly around gender, where male students over time leave the study at higher numbers than female students. And there's also high attrition and greater attrition amongst the less academically prepared. And so, again, those are two sources of bias in the study. We're not going to say much about gender differences because of the first. And in terms of the second, we've lost the bottom of the distribution. And so what we're showing you here is likely biased to be a more positive set of outcomes that would be the case if we had a fully representative sample. We also added to this study these in-depth interviews with 80 respondents when they were 2 years out. So we have not just their surveys, but we have their individual accounts about how they understand their experiences.
Thank you. So I'm going to start at the beginning, which is where things really matter the most. I'm going to start in college, and in particular how students think and understand what college is about. And Nathan is going to be our case in point. If you look at a handout on your tables, this is actually the second paragraph on that handout. But if you're in the back and can read the slides, it's actually the second paragraph in that handout. But so Nathan, similar to almost all of the graduates we interviewed, was more socially than academically engaged while in college. I went to a lot of events and parties and all that stuff, he reported. When we asked what he learned in college, he commented, "Not that much, actually, from college. I guess just hanging out with my friends. When I first started, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. That's why I took business. It was kind of a general thing that could help me with anything. I wish I would have put more thought in what I actually wanted to do with my life." He reported to us that he spent half his time studying at college with friends, and he studied alone less than 5 hours per week. He also reported that he wished he had joined more clubs while he was in college. Nathan is not unique. Nathan is very much representative of what college students look like, and in terms of how they spend their time and how they understand what college and college experiences is about. So this is the senior year data. These are seniors in the last semester of their senior year, where we have asked them essentially how they spend their time. We asked about a range of different activities, but what I focus on here is how much time they dedicate to academics. So college seniors say they spend about 15 hours a week on going to class and lab, or at least that's what they're expected to go, right, with 15 credit hours. And they say they study about 12 hours a week. Now, a good portion of that time is actually spent studying with peers, which we have shown Academically Adrift is not really studying, or at least not the kind of studying that produces high gains on a CLA. And so they spend about 9 hours actually studying alone, which is what we call. But even if we give them the 12 hours studying and the 15 hours that they go to class and lab, together, right, they're spending actually a very small portion of their time on academic pursuits. Right? So this is we're looking at a whole week of time, and only 15% of the time in a week is spent either going to class, going to lab, studying, right, preparing for class and lab, any kind of an academic enterprise or an endeavor. Now, while Nathan is not unique, and while students in higher ed, and these are full-time 4-year college students, so this is a traditional age population, and even though he's not unique in his lack of attention to academics, the time that we are in is in some ways unique, right? Which is that if we look at study time over time, right, it has dropped precipitously since about 1960s, right? So this is the work by Philip Babcock and Mandy Marks that came out in 2011, and they used a range of different surveys to try to track full-time college students' amount of time they spend in class as well as studying. Okay. And if you look at that over time, they actually started earlier, but nothing happens early in the century. The lines are flat. And if you look at the time spent in class and lab, that time stays flat, right? So it's about 15 hours the whole time through. But if you look at study time, in terms of how much time students report studying a week, that drops precipitously. That drops in about half between 1960s and today. So while in 1960s, right, being a full-time college student meant being full-time. It meant 15 hours in class and 25 hours studying. Today, right, the study time has dropped in half, and so being a full-time college student is a whole lot less demanding, at least in terms of time students dedicate to their studies. So the time you're in, again, is in some ways different. What's also unique and different is that we, as a country, as a nation, are far behind other nations in terms of the amount of time our students spend in academic pursuits. This is a slide that looks at the Eurostudent data for a range of European countries and looks at a full-time college student's time in class as well as studying, so kind of collective time spent in academics. And the United States in this slide is the last. We are actually next to last. The only country that spends fewer hours in class or lab is Slovak Republic. So we do have a distinction of being unique in that regard. We're also unique in another respect, and that is by having a very residentially focused college experience. Okay. If you look at the national comparisons and we look at the number of students who while they're students, are living in different arrangements, this is the proportion of students who say they live with parents, right? So this is actually students who are full-time college students and where they live. And in most other countries, a large proportion of students live with their parents, right? Live with families while they're pursuing higher education. In the United States, that percentage is really low, right? We have a distinctly residential environment in which students go away to spend their time in college surrounded by their peers, not at home living with their families. In part related to this pattern, right, to the fact that we have a very residentially focused experience in which students go away to spend time on a four-year campus, our higher education system is also very expensive compared to other nations. So this is educational expenditures for post-secondary education per student in a range of different countries. U.S. is the highest, has the highest of all the European countries, and actually it's about twice the average in the European countries in terms of how much we spend per student on our higher education. And so, again, it is a system in which students spend relatively little time studying. They are spending their time away at college, surrounded by their peers, and we are investing a large amount of resources for them to do so. So since we're investing this many resources and students are, spending their time in college with their peers, and it's important to see how they think about being academically engaged, right? So we have shown that they're not spending lots of time studying, but it's important to think about how they think about academic engagement and what that actually means and represents to them. So here are some ways in which undergraduates, and this is actually after they graduated from college, but are reflecting back to their academic engagement in college, what they say about academically engagement. They all say they were academically engaged, overwhelmingly, right? When the question is how engaged they are. But these are examples of what they say that means, right? Because I was a very good student. I did all my homework and I studied for all my tests. I was pretty committed. I went to about 90-95% of my classes, and I did all my homework, and for the most part, I did the readings, even those 40 pages. Actually, I put forth a good deal of effort. I was great about going to class. I think I really only missed a handful of classes the entire time I was in college. I studied. Any homework I had to do, I did. I was fairly academically engaged in that I tried very hard not to fail most of my classes. I was a good student. I did my homework on time. I never missed deadlines. Right? What is stunning about these comments is the minimal amount of effort and engagement that students are putting forth and saying, I was very academically engaged. I did really well in college. I showed up. And most of the time, I did what I was required. I didn't miss my deadlines. Right? I actually did that. So students are thinking, they're very academically engaged, and we are supporting those kinds of attitudes about being very engaged because these same students who are saying that, I basically showed up to class are getting about a 3.2 GPA. Okay? Even those who are in Nathan's category, right, the studying 5 or fewer hours a week, right, so the category of barely engaged, even though they might say, you know, I showed up to class and I did my homework most of the time, they're getting about a 3.2 GPA, right? So in higher education, we are essentially telling students that this minimum amount of effort of showing up and maybe doing most of the work most of the time is adequate. It is actually more than adequate. It's actually quite sufficient. It's a B, more than a B average. And it's not only that students internalize that to think that, you know, I'm working hard enough, right? This is actually quite academically engaged behavior. They also think they learned a lot. So we ask students to report on, you know, how much they think they've developed different kinds of skills in college. And so we're looking at, you know, writing, problem solving, critical thinking, a range of different skills. What's in this slide is the proportion of students who thought they learned a lot. That was the black bar. And the proportion of students who thought they learned a moderate amount, the gray bar. The difference between the bars and the 100 percentile, right, are the students who didn't think they learned a whole lot. So first of all, you can see that most students think they learned a great deal, right? Very few students said that they didn't learn a whole lot, except for understanding charts and graphs. I guess we're not really teaching that. But even there, majority still thought that they did quite well, even on that. And if you look at those black bars, right, students who thought they learned a great deal during their time in college, this is very high. And critical thinking is leading the way. Okay? Students really think that they have learned how to think critically in college. They've really developed those skills over their time in higher education. So our commercials and our mission statements seem to do quite well, because that's what we say a lot, right? All of our mission statements and our conversation in higher education oftentimes talks about critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking and how we want to you know, develop those skills, and students internalize that. With high grades and lots of discussion, they seem to think that they've learned a great deal. The problem, of course, is what you've seen Academically Adrift and what we have forward, is that if you actually try to measure critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing, students don't seem to do that well. So the first bullet there is the bullet that Richard mentioned, which was what happens in the first 2 years of college. That was in Academically Adrift, and when those findings first came out, there was an obvious question, which was, well, but you know, it's just the first 2 years of college. Maybe they will learn more later. First 2 years, big classes, they don't have the majors yet. You know, it's not really the best time to try to learn how to think critically. They will really learn those skills later on in college. And we hoped, actually, that was going to be the case, but if you look at the last 2 years of college, they're no better than the first 2 years of college. So the overall gain over the whole 4 years of college is about a half a standard deviation gain. Or, you know, another way to think about it is that if you took seniors who were at the 50th percentile and compared them to the incoming freshmen, right, they would be only 18 percentile points ahead, right? So they made some progress, but not a whole lot. And I think more importantly, if you actually divide the learning per semester, the last 2 years of college, students will actually learn about as much as they did in the first 2 years. And that's in some ways particularly sobering, to think about that in the last 2 years when they're doing their majors and supposedly smaller classes and supposedly they're being more dedicated and we are requiring more of them, they're not improving these skills in any higher rate. Now, seniors don't report studying more than sophomores or taking harder classes than sophomores, right? So in some ways, perhaps, you know, it's not surprising that the gains are not any different as they were over time. The other thing just worth noting is that when these gains first came out and when we talked in Academically Adrift and later in our subsequent reports about the low gains in the first 2 years and then all 4 years of college, an obvious question was, you know, but maybe it's a CLA, right? You're using a measure that's new, maybe that measure didn't capture the learning particularly well, and one can certainly ask those kinds of questions. Ernie Pascarella at Iowa with a team of researchers has used the Wabash study, which is a similar kind of a study, but has different sample of schools, different sample of students, and a different assessment of critical thinking. They're not using CLA, they're using CAT, which is actually developed by the ACT. And when they look at the learning gains over the 4 years of college, their learning gains are about 0.44 standard deviations, right, which is basically very close to our 0.47 standard deviations. So whether you look at CLA, whether you look at a different indicator, whether you look at different kinds of students over 4 years, this seems to be how much students gain while they are in college. Now, while these averages are what they are, right, they're low, and on average students don't learn a whole lot, as Richard mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of variation in that learning. And I'm going to show you one slide that looks at 205 to 209 gains, so freshman to senior, not just the sophomore gains. So what this slide shows is the distribution of scores for freshmen and seniors at less selective, selective, and more selective institutions. And the black bar is a 25th to 75th percentile. That's about how much we are capturing in that middle. And what's important there is that you look at across those bars is that there's a little bit of learning, and there's a little bit of learning across all school types. Our analysis suggests there's a little bit higher gains in a CLA in a highly selective schools, but it's not by a large extent, right? That there is kind of a slight advantage of being in a more selective context. However, right, in comparison to that kind of small advantage, that distribution, right, the variation of learning within each particular institution, type, is huge. Right? And even if you look at specific institutions, right, there's a lot more variation in gains within an institution than across institutions. And so it's an important point to think about that as we think about these low gains, it's not about a few schools, it's not even a particular set of schools. It's a pattern that is pervasive across, and it's a pattern that's really demonstrated within institutions because most of the variation in gains and how much students learn actually happens within, not across.
So let's shift again now to what happens after students graduate from college and attempt transitions to adult life. And I say to adult life because part of the transitions they attempt are in the labor market, but they're much broader than that. And so in the book we try to spend a lot of attention on a broad range of outcomes. Because of time constraints here, we're going to focus primarily on the labor market transitions. So let's circle back to Nathan, and he's the opening vignette in our latest book. I can definitely do better, Nathan reported to us in an interview 2 years after finishing college. I feel like I'm not using my degree at all. And on the surface, it was hard to disagree with him. Although he had majored in business administration with a 3.9 grade point average, Nathan was living back at home with his parents, had significant college loans to repay, and like many of his peers, felt lucky to have any job at all. He found his on Craigslist. Nathan was a delivery driver for a national pharmacy chain. He picked up and dropped off film and other items from the warehouse, shuttling materials to local branch outlets throughout the state. He had been working this job for the last 6 months and had annual earnings of less than $20,000. Nathan also reported to us that his employer had recently cut back his hours, and as a result, he was spending 5 hours per week looking for other employment. Well, how typical was Nathan? There's a lot of information up here in the pie chart. These are the students who are not back in school, in grad school, 2 years after graduating. And about a third of the sample is back in grad school. There's been a very large increase in the number of students returning for additional degrees after their college degrees. And our data is representative of that, where, again, about a third of students 2 years out are back in grad school. What we do find is that for the students that are in the labor market, about a quarter of them are really having very poor outcomes, and less than half, if you define a positive outcome as they're in a full-time job making more than $30,000, that's a little bit less than half. That's the clicker works, these two boxes here. These are the ones that are formally unemployed, that is, they don't have jobs and they're actively looking. These are people working less than 20 hours per week. These are other part-time employees, full-time making less than $20,000 like Nathan, and full-time making less than $30,000, between $20,000 and $30,000. So again, they're struggling. Josip and I want to make very clear, and we try to in the book, we're not saying it does not pay to go to college. It absolutely pays to go to college, even if you're taking on debt, reasonable debt, and compared to not going to college. And so in the book, we show that the unemployment rates of people not that didn't go to college, about twice that of those that went to college. So again, we're not saying it doesn't pay to go to college. What we're saying is the value students are getting out of going to college is not as great as it should be and could be. And so that's a different statement and claim, but an important difference, because again, a lot of the rhetoric in the media today is, oh, it doesn't pay to go to college. And there's really, if you look at the social science data, it's very clear that it pays to go to college, but I think it's also clear that we could do a better job in preparing people for these transitions. These are, it's another way to think of people's economic circumstances 2 years out. Again, about a little bit more than 20% of the sample has significant debt, more than $30,000. Two-thirds of the sample has some debt, and again, about 20% has these debts that are fairly high. 25% of students are back living at home with their parents. These are not students that were commuting that are continuing to live with their parents. These are students that came back, boomerang, back to the home, into the basement. I had a colleague came up here and said, "Oh, I'm very interested. My child graduated in 2009. Whether or not they're in the basement living at home we'll follow up afterwards." And close to 80% of graduates 2 years out say they're receiving financial support from their parents. And so again, very, very different normative expectations and behaviors than a generation or two ago, where people might be helping out their parents after they graduate from college financially. Again, the assumption here is the graduates continue to need additional financial support and help and assistance. Another question we asked in the beginning of the presentation: does the CLA matter? Does this measure of generic skills, do these generic skills matter? And we find very strong evidence that indeed they do. These are results that control for a range of differences in social background. And what we find is that if you compare students that did better on the CLA compared to students that did worse, and the high CLA is a standard deviation above the mean versus a standard deviation below. And you're more likely, with a low CLA, significantly more likely to report that you're unemployed. You're significantly more likely to report that you're in unskilled employment. And by unskilled employment, we operationalize that in the book to be you're in a job where the majority of the people in the job did not go to college, not even a year of college. Imagine like a barista or a delivery driver like Nathan. And then very telling is this job loss figure, right? So these are, if you had a job at any point in time in the last year, did you lose the job? And you're twice as likely to have lost the job if you had low CLA scores than high CLA scores. So again, it suggests that it's not these results are not just kind of an artifact of some sort of underlying selection bias, but there's something different about what these students can do that employers, even if they don't see when they hire them, quickly learn and dismiss them at very different rates. Another way to look at some of the other results we showed, this is full-time skilled employment. So we're predicting here the likelihood that you have a full-time job that's skilled. And by skilled, again, remember our definition, you're in a job where the majority of people at least have some college. So it's a very low definition of skilled. But even there, you see, the rates overall a little bit more than 20% weren't able to find such jobs. And the CLA matters. But let's look at a few other things that people might be interested in. College selectivity, the entering SAT scores of students in these colleges, it does matter. It does confer some advantage, or is at least associated with it, because of the different types of students and the resources people are coming, although we, again, try to control out for that in some of our modeling. And then there's differences across majors in people, graduates being able to make these successful transitions. And interestingly, we call it a paradox in our in the book and explored at some greater depth. Look at business. Business, if you remember Academically Adrift, they are at rock bottom in terms of academic rigor and CLA gains. Why are those graduates doing so well here? Their CLA scores are not high, but they are doing better than a lot of the arts and science majors. Now, part of it is selection. The arts and science majors are more likely to go to graduate school, so there's some selection going on. But part of it is also, we think, these other things. That in the business majors, they have a higher rate of doing internships, apprenticeships, and taking advantage of school job placement services. And each of these things we demonstrate in the book is associated with positive early labor market outcomes over and above the CLA. And so imagine if you're interested in improving outcomes, imagine how much better the business outcomes would be if they were able to gain on these generic competencies and they did these things. Or another way to look at it is imagine how well some of the arts and science majors could do if they had experienced some of these mechanisms associated with positive transitions as well. Now, we heard a lot from the students and the graduates in the study that they thought it's not what you know, it's who you know. They were investing a lot in social networks because they thought it mattered. Sociability, they thought, mattered, and social networks mattered. We tested it, but we found very little evidence of that being the case. A very small number of jobs were found through social networks. A lot of their friends were unemployed also, or in crummy jobs also. So they weren't much assistance, and so very few jobs were found that way, and the jobs that were found through friendship networks were worse. They made less money and had lower attributes. Maybe it'll pay dividends in the long run, but again, early transitions, it does not help. We want to have at least one slide in the deck that looks something other than labor market outcomes, because we share with the community assembled here that college and university is about much more than just labor market preparation. And so we measured civic engagement in two ways and found very distressing levels of civic engagement 2 years out for college graduates. In terms of reading newspapers monthly or never, about a third of students, 36%, said they read a newspaper online or in print monthly or never, and 39% said they discussed politics with a friend, family, or coworker monthly or never. So they did not learn from college that this was an essential feature of adult responsibility, of adult roles. Now, given Nathan's difficult transition and circumstances, what kind of sense does he make of his condition? And this was a surprise to us. In spite of the current difficulties, Nathan and most of his peers believe that their lives would ultimately be better than their parents. Just because I've had more opportunities, Nathan assured us. That's the way the world is right now. College might not have delivered on all its promises, but one thing Nathan and his peers appeared to have acquired was a sense of social membership and entitlement. They were college graduates, and rewards would surely follow. Let me give you some examples of that in our data. Perception of their trajectory relative to their parents. 95% of graduates said their life would be the same or better than their parents. And remember, a quarter of them are living back at home with their parents. And 75 to 80% are getting financial assistance. But it doesn't get in the way of their optimism about the future. And what we found very interesting was that it didn't matter how difficult their circumstances were. Unemployed or employed, unskilled job, skilled job, same level of optimism about the future. And that was a real surprise to us. These are both better, predictions of they're unemployed, but they still think their life's going to be better than their parents. Here's some examples of this from the interviews. The first, a grocery store cashier living with his parents. I feel generally confident in the direction of my life. I wish I had a little bit more direction, but... And an unemployed person, a female graduate living with her parents. I'm feeling okay about the way my life is going. It would be cool if I had a job. I don't know. I tend to look on the bright side because I do what I can to change the things I dislike in my life, but I'm not going to hate on things that I can't change because they're going to stay, so I might as well accept them. And then this final one, a program assistant living with the parents. I have good ideas and I know what I want to do. I know my path will be positive, but things are moving at a lot slower pace than I expected. If nobody will give me a job, I'll just go start my own job to do what I want to do. It will be different than my parents' life. Depends really on what you mean by better. I know I won't be as rich as my parents, but I know I'll be doing something that I like. So here we have a little bit of a reframing of the question. That might be partly what's going on here. But again, incredible optimism. And what we show, we often use these backdrops of national data, college graduates and non-college graduates in the book to illustrate what's different about college graduates. The dark line above is college graduates over time and the last decade or so, and less than college graduates, less than college degrees. And what you see is this real divergence going on where college graduates have, over the past decade, have just been growing optimism about their future, and the rest of young adults really are increasingly despairing about their future. So we have this divergence that we find very notable and interesting, and I think there's multiple causes of that, the greater inequality in our society more broadly, but also remember, part of their optimism is they thought they did very well in school, right? They didn't work very hard, many of them, but they were taught that they had a B plus average, a B plus average for often no more than an hour a day of homework. And so it seemed from college, perhaps, that success wasn't really all that difficult, right? They had taught, they had learned attitudes and dispositions about what life was going to be like in college that perhaps were unrealistic. But nevertheless, there's diverse causes for this. We're not saying optimism is bad. Optimism is healthy. It's a healthy characteristic. Psychological health and well-being and all these things are associated with it. But we found this very striking in our data. Some said they thought life would be better because they had a college degree, more education than my parents. Different reasons. Interestingly, when we asked about the extent to which they had clear goals and direction in their life, did they get that from 4 years of college? Many of them did not. So slightly over half of the graduates said had clear goals and direction. So there's large numbers of students after 4 years of college drifted through college and university and are still really adrift in terms of next steps. We're running out of time, so just a quick summary would be that there's limited focus on academics and limited development of general collegiate skills for large numbers of students. Many of them are having difficulties transitioning into the labor market and transitioning to adulthood more generally. And students with better performance in terms of these generic skills and competencies did better in terms of their adult transitions. And although they were having all these difficulties, again, we had this surprising finding of really incredible optimism. And also, one other thing I would say is not just optimism about the future, but when they look back at their college years, very romantic and sentimental attachments to college. They learned a lot there, and they have a real fondness for their college and university experiences, even though we think that they were not always served as well as they potentially could have been.
So what's next? After these kinds of findings and results, I think one way to think about it is to step back for a moment and think about a broader context in which we are embedded. I don't need to spend much time on this slide for this audience in terms of realizing and thinking about all the external pressures that higher education is facing these days, with questions about the value of college. As Richard pointed out, I think it's is college worth it is a question that is misguided in terms of labor market outcomes and all kinds of other outcomes. College graduates do better than high school graduates, but there is a question about what value are students really getting from college, and can we do better at that? And it's not only questions, right? It's not only that policymakers and parents and a broader community is asking questions about what college is doing. They're also starting to come up with their own ways of defining that. So the federal government has recently talked a lot about developing a rating system of colleges and universities based on the outcomes and the value that the federal government defined as very important. And indeed, lots of states, not just the federal government, have had these kinds of conversations. They've had conversations about what's the value of college and how do we measure it, how do we improve it, how do we reward schools, quote unquote, that produce value and those that don't. The big issue is in kind of how those conversations are being carried out and what kind of outcomes we are getting and what quality ends up meaning. And so in a college scorecard, so the outcomes that really matter are largely financial. And even when we look at a labor market and that's kind of college debt kind of an outcomes, but even when we look at kind of the college outcomes after college, it's usually early labor market outcomes. Those are problematic on many different levels, right? One is they're very unstable. Students change jobs a lot, they move a lot, they're going in and out, they're going in and out of graduate school. There's lots of students who go to graduate school, particularly in arts and science fields. There's also very little to no variation in labor market outcomes in wages, in particular early wages, across schools. Okay, so you actually can't use wages as an indicator of quality if you want to somehow measure schools and hold schools accountable, because wages actually do not vary across institutions if you control for the characteristics students bring in, so their own test scores and background characteristics. And so lots of these conversations and discussions that are being out there are perhaps well-meaning by people who are concerned about some of the findings we are reporting here in terms of spending a good amount of resources on college and students perhaps not developing the skills or being prepared for transitions afterwards. But the question is, how do we actually think about students and student outcomes and what colleges ought to and can do to improve those? We strongly believe that faculty have to be at the forefront of this conversation. Right? It's not about policymakers defining what college quality is and what students ought to learn or be able to do. That faculty members have to be a leading voice in this conversation. To try to facilitate that, we've been working for the last year or so on trying to get faculty members together to have a consensus-driven discussion about learning outcomes and assessment. We've been working with 6 different fields, history, communication, sociology, biology, economics, and business, working closely with the Social Science Research Council, with support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Teagle Foundation. But the goal of the project has been to get faculty members. There's about 10 to 12 members per each discipline that have been meeting in New York, really to sit down and have the conversation. What should students learn in different disciplines? And how can we define it? How can we put that forth? How can we have our voice heard in terms of what kind of outcomes we believe ought to be observed and ought to be developed in college? The main goals of the project are really to engage the faculty members in a consensus-driven discussion, to set priorities for learning. Again, what students ought to be able to do and know should be something that faculty members define themselves, to communicate those priorities to larger audiences, to their disciplines, to their schools, to their provosts and deans, as well as to their policymakers and others outside of academia, right? To actually be very clear and explicit about what we do in higher education and what students learn when they take our classes and major in our fields. We've spent a good amount of time also trying to talk to faculty about the current assessments, just to get a sense of what is out there, what do people do, what do different institutions do when they assess learning, because lots of assessment is currently going on, and so the question is what is happening, what do faculty think about those assessments, and can we generate some new ideas about assessment of learning outcomes. And this has largely reflected faculty members' overall dissatisfaction with the current assessments, which tend to be very content-driven. Lots of the big national assessments that currently exist that can be used across schools, across institutions, are very content-driven. And so the questions here are really how can we teach students not to just repeat and remember, but actually to apply, to synthesize, and to think at a much higher and more complex levels, right? To develop the mind of the discipline, as opposed to just be able to repeat the information. And so we're trying to think about how could you do that? How could you measure these more complex skills that we hope that we develop in our classes and our disciplines. And of course, it all feeds into this endeavor to actually learn more about how students learn, what they learn, and engage in a cycle of continuous improvement so that students over time can actually develop the skills that we believe are really important in higher education. Just to kind of, as a wrap-up, say kind of what are the goals in terms of what we hope to accomplish in this project and its endeavor, in terms of the principles guiding the project, which I think are really important to keep in mind, not just for this project, but for more broadly, for thinking about how to do assessment and how to think about student learning outcomes. Again, we think faculty need to be at the center of this conversation. They're the ones who actually teach students and develop the skills, whether generic competencies or subject-specific knowledge and abilities. Students from all backgrounds and institutions should be able to demonstrate their learning, which has been always our emphasis on longitudinal designs and comparing what students know when they come in and what they know when they leave, right? It's not about just testing them when they leave, because the schools that recruit really well will look a lot better, right? The issue is really how much does an institution contribute to what students know. So it means having to measure that growth, that learning, that improvement over time. We need high quality measures. The institutions should have the ability to use those on a voluntary basis. And an important point, which is that no single measure should stand on its own, that every institution thinking about assessment should have a holistic set of outcomes and a holistic assessment plan that considers both generic competencies, like critical thinking, complex reasoning, that considers subject-specific knowledge, like those taught in the majors, and it thinks more broadly about the outcomes, whether it's civic engagement or participation or other ways that we want our students to develop while they are in college. And so, as just a final slide, is that we believe educators need to lead the improvement of teaching, learning, and assessment. It is not something that should come from the outside, whether it's states or federal government. It is not a matter of accountability. It is a matter of professional responsibility. But it's a matter of us as educators, us as faculty, us as administrators, thinking carefully what we want students to learn, and then ways in which we can develop those skills and actually improve. Right? It is us who are both responsible for defining and improving and making sure our students do well as they leave our higher education institutions. And, given all the labor market results, there's a question, of course, that we think colleges need to provide better support for graduate transitions in terms of institutional attention, both to generic skills, as well as to thinking about other ways in which they can facilitate college graduates' learning and transition to life after college. So we're going to stop there. That is our website. You can write that down. There's lots more information about this new project that we've been involved with disciplines and who is participating in those endeavors. There's information on both books and other stuff that you may find useful. And, of course, our email is there, and we're happy to answer any questions via email. But also, I think we have a little bit of time now to entertain any questions as well.
So thank you very much. So we're happy to entertain questions. There's a mic if you want it, or else you'll just have to stand up and speak loudly. Please.
I have a question about how the graduate school piece is fitting into this. At one point, you had talked about students. I don't know if you were able to determine which students were voluntarily all along intentionally planning and successfully doing so to go to graduate school versus the ones who were unemployed for 6 months or a year and said, no, this isn't working, I better go back to school. So that's part one. And the second part is, are there successful students who are, falling out of this study too early, so to speak, because they were never intending? I'm thinking of health sciences in particular. And if you're going on to med school, if you are in a physical therapy or physician assistant program, which is typically, by definition, a 5 or 6 year program, I know ours is as seamless to the DPT. I mean, you're not stopping out with the bachelor's degree. How is that fitting into what you're doing?
The first question, we could look at it within. There are certainly students who were in graduate school the first year and then a second year, right? So those are the ones who straight out of college went to graduate school. But there are many of them who also in a second year go in, and we can certainly look at whether those are the ones who struggled in that first year and decided that, it's better to go to graduate school than have an unskilled job and work no hours. There's definitely, I'd say there's likely some of that in there. We haven't actually broken down the portions to take a look, but we certainly can.
I would say there's two things. So there's a large section of the book that does an analysis on graduate student outcomes. The CLA is related to full-time graduate study. There's also students need part-time programs. It's not related to that. There's a big expansion of that. And then when we asked students what they were doing, we had a real diverse set of responses, including from one, they were in grad school so that they could have health benefits. So there was a real range. But overall, if you look at the not just at the recession data that our study focuses on, but overall, there's just an upward trend where, again, about now 30% of college graduates return to get an additional degree on top of that. So, but yeah, like you said, it's complicated. It varies across major. It varies in very complex ways. Sir, and then next.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Realistic one, given the downward trend in wages for all people?
Yeah. So that's a good question. In fact, actually, in the book we agree with you because we say income early wages is a very poor indicator of transitions. Let's use occupational characteristics. And that's why we focus on this unskilled difference here. I didn't really have a chance to emphasize it fully. And so that we don't want to penalize people that are in the Peace Corps, say, that are in Teach for America, they might be making 30, but in jobs that are aligned with their professional aspirations but don't pay very much. So we're sociologists. We like occupational characteristics, not income, which economists like. So we agree with you. But the other response is that the average wage of full-time work is $35,000, and so it's a cut we're making here. But I agree with you; it's not adequate. It's not an adequate and sufficient way to define successful labor market transitions.
Well, that's a difficult question. I'd be doing a lot better if I could answer that one. But part of the MCL, this new project that we are working on with SRC, is part of that endeavor. One of the challenges, and after the first book, lots of people ask, so what has changed since the first book came out? I think what has changed is that lots of places, lots of departments, lots of institutions, lots of faculty members have taken these discussions to heart and have started thinking carefully, as well as associations. How do we measure student learning? What are students learning? How do we examine it? How do we prove it? The issue is that those conversations have stayed very disconnected. Right? They're oftentimes at institutional level or just in my own department or in my own course even. I think part of the conversation and part of the transition that's needed here is figuring out how to lift those conversations to a much broader plane and a much broader level, and to be able to define student learning outcomes and measure them, right? Whether it's in a more qualitative way through rubrics, or whether it is through a more quantitative way through multiple choice tests, or there's actually very creative designs now where students do scenarios and students do kind of interactive games on computers. I mean, with the new technology, there's amazing amount of flexibility in how one can think about assessment creatively, and so I think it's in some ways it's the collision between the very complicated, very nuanced, very individualized, and this kind of attempt to have something that's more general, more applicable across the board. And I think there is a way to bring what we really care about, the complex task, not just graduation, not just credit hours, not just some kind of a multiple choice test, but some form of assessment that we believe measures what we think is important, and it captures higher order skills to that higher level. But I think the faculty will have to be much more stronger and unified voice in that conversation.
Yeah. And I was going to say, just add one more thing. So institutions are important, AAC&U being one, to bridge those different communities. The other one I would really emphasize is the disciplinary associations. They really have a responsibility, in my opinion, to represent faculty voice, to elevate faculty voice into playing a responsible role in this larger discourse with stakeholders and the public. And I think some of the disciplinary associations, history would be one example, doing an excellent job at that. But that's really faculty as individuals, very difficult to do that work.
So in the first book, right, we try to map out time students spend in fraternity sororities, students' time they spend in different clubs, organizations. We had fairly rough indicators of those activities. They were either not positive, or meaning they were not contributing at all to the CLA gains, or they were negative, like sororities and fraternities, right? In terms of the after college, we've looked at a few. We had some indicators of whether students were in leadership positions in college. That didn't seem to predict. The finding job through friends, which is lots of them spend time in these social activities because they think if I find friends who get jobs, that didn't help them a whole lot in finding jobs. Now, I think so we have some indicators of the college life, and we don't find much evidence that it facilitates either critical thinking gains or the labor market outcomes. But I think what's important to step back and think about is that oftentimes what happens with extracurriculars is that they're kind of haphazard. Right? There's a very little integration among the co-curriculars or co-curriculars with the academics. I think the core curriculum actually has a lot of potential, particularly lots of service learning these days, lots of clubs and organizations that are trying to have an academic component. I think that actually it's powerful. Students say, when they're asked in other studies about where the learning happens, they say outside of the classroom, right? And so there are many reasons you can take that classroom out and bring that outside life in. But if any learning does happen outside, it seems to be largely by accident in some ways. I think it's a great potential that we can really tap in and bring to strengthen what students do and how they develop during their time.
Yeah, I mean, I think another way to think about it is there's such a problem with intentionality, structure design in the academic programs, and you have twice that problem in the space, the co-curricular space outside it. We haven't even gotten it right in the academic programs. Gen Ed, for an example, where there's a very vibrant discussion going on in this community about how to do that work better. And so, yes, that's the case. The other thing I would just add to your comment is that is what students are thinking when they think about college and their orientations. We document in this new book. This is what they think college is. This is the academic engagement pieces we just put up there. A sentence: I do my work, I go to classes. We also ask them about their social engagement, and we don't have enough space on the slides to include how they describe that part of their lives. So. So we touch on that. We use backdrops in the book to compare college graduates and non-college graduates and things like unemployment, and we look at that over time, and so that partially does it. Where these results fall short, ours and others in the space, is that we often compare only within the U.S., and we're in a globalized economy now where multinational firms are shifting production across national borders. And so the real comparisons that you'd want to make are our college graduates versus college graduates in other countries. And it's a much more difficult task. There's some recent OECD work on competencies, adult competencies in different countries. Our college graduates do not fare very well in comparison to the ones in Europe. And we know that there are shifts in where multinational firms do software production, engineering, and architectural design, and so on. And so, but again, it becomes a much more complex set of questions that we try to touch on in the book, but we don't really do a serious analysis of it. Okay, so we're going to finish up on that because I think we're over time. That's a great question. That's exactly the work we're doing right now with the MCL project, where we're convening faculty within disciplines to have these discussions about what student learning outcomes should be in those disciplines, and how would you kind of assess it in a reasonable, productive way. For instructional improvement as also for external communities. And so we very much agree with that it's not just generic competencies. In fact, generic competencies might be demonstrated best within disciplines and within fields where they're applied to specific questions. But that's difficult work, and there's the CLA and CAP and MAP in the generic space. But within the subject-specific space, the measures really don't exist. The ones that are out there, like Josipa said, they're surface content knowledge, they're multiple choice, they're not worth assigning to your students. And so how do we get faculty together to kind of create a better set of tools out there that value these things that faculty like you and Josipa and I think are also important, along with the generic competencies. Thank you very much for spending time with us.